Thank you all for being here again. My name is Che. I'm with an organization called Faunalytics, and I'm here to talk to you about lapsed vegetarians and vegans. And I want to start off with a question. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's also a bit serious, which is, how many vegetarians does it take to screw in a light bulb? Any guesses? Anybody want to shout it out? Nobody wants to take. The answer is 6. And the reason for that is because before you get to the end, 5 out of those 6 new vegetarians will abandon the diet. And so, unfortunately, it's a very high lapse rate. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, but that's probably very different for vegans, right? Well, it's a little bit different. So for vegans, the abandonment rate is 70%. So still, 2/3 or more than 2/3 of vegans end up abandoning the diet before they obviously finish it. So this is something that we as an organization wanted to take a close look at. And what we did is, well, first off, let me just tell you a little bit about Faunalytics very briefly, which is that for about 15 years, we've served as sort of the research arm of the animal protection movement. And we do that a few different ways. One is that we work directly with nonprofit clients to help them measure their impact and sort of achieve more results and more impact and improve their effectiveness. We also conduct independent studies on things that we think are most important, and we provide a wide range of resources for individual advocates to help them sort of make sense of data and hopefully apply it to their work for animals. So for us, we wanted to take a close look at this issue of veg recidivism because obviously, well, we had a lot of anecdotal evidence or hunches that it was a problem, but we didn't have any solid data behind it. So what we did is we worked with Harris Interactive, which is now part of Nielsen, to study the issue in depth. And we surveyed more than 11,000 people to get sort of a natural fallout and a representative sample of these folks. And the idea is that these are low incidence populations, and so you need to really oversample in order to get them. And what we got was a little over 200 that were current vegetarians and vegans, and a little over 1,100 lapsed vegetarians and vegans as part of that sample. And just a quick note that we had a great team led by Catherine Asher, who's in the room, who's our research director, as well as a number of PhDs involved, and we're thankful as well to our sponsors who helped fund the study. This slide, I think, is probably self-explanatory. Don't think I need to go through it. So. No, this is, joking aside, what this is the path that respondents could have taken through our survey. And the point that I want to make here, the overarching one, is that we didn't just ask people, are you vegetarian or are you vegan? Right? We took a much more robust approach to that because you always get that overstated if you just ask people what they are. So instead, we went through a list of, I think it was 16 different food items, including non-animal related food items to sort of obscure what we were asking about, and asked people if they were current vegetarians or vegans. So we assessed them that way. Then we asked, have you ever been vegetarian or vegan in the past? If they said yes, we walked through that list of food items again to validate whether they actually were vegetarian or vegan in the past. So we used a pretty robust sort of method to identify those vegetarians and vegans. Now, I should note that there are still a number of limitations. Despite how robust the study is, there are a number of limitations that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about these results. First off, this is dietary veganism and vegetarianism only. We did not get into the other aspects, which are certainly important, but just too big for a study of our scope. This is also just a snapshot in time, right? So we're not looking at this longitudinally, which would be ideal, and we hope to do studies like that in the future. But this study in particular is just a snapshot in time. It's also subject to what we call social desirability bias, which is the idea that some respondents will respond in a way that they think the researchers or that society would more approve of them responding. And you see that more commonly with surveys around social issues or anything that has sort of a moral component to it. And so that creeps into some of these survey results as well. Non-response bias is an issue in any large-scale survey, and so that's the likelihood that the people who responded to the survey may be different in some important ways than those who didn't, so that's an issue. And I would say that all of that leads me to say that this is, when we look at these results, think about it in terms of correlation and associations. This is not causation. You know, a causation study would be much bigger and would probably have that longitudinal component. So with those limitations in mind, and also I should mention that this is self-reported data. That's probably obvious given the sample that we looked at. So with all that in mind, here's what we found. 10% of the adult population in the country is a former vegetarian or former vegan. Only 2% is a current vegetarian or vegan. And that number may seem lower than what you've seen in some other estimates, but we stand by that number given the sort of robust approach that we took to it. And I would say that in past surveys that we've done, we've found a similarly lower number than what many other research groups or advocates have found. If you extrapolate that information out to the broader population, that adds up to about 24 million former vegetarians and vegans, and just under 5 million current vegetarians and vegans. So if we take a look at what got them there, so what motivated these people to become vegetarian or vegan, and it's a pretty different story for current versus former. So for current vegetarians and vegans, we see a multitude of motives that they claim to have had when they first became vegetarian or vegan. And so 5 different motives were present among a majority of those current vegetarians and vegans. On the other hand, the only major motivation for the former vegetarians and vegans was health, and that was at 58%. We just want to explore a couple of interesting facts, and let me say that the report that we've produced are quite in-depth, so we're only able to scratch the surface here. I'll provide the links at the end so everyone can get the full data. But taking a look at sort of how long these people maintain the diet, what we see is a lot of short timers, right? So a third of them lapsed in 3 months or less, and over half of them lapsed in a year or less. And so what I should say is that our sample includes people who may not have gone vegetarian for reasons that they intended to sustain, right? So it could have been a short-term health issue, could have been even a short-term spiritual issue, something along those lines that caused people to make that change without intending to be a long-term vegetarian or vegan. But we wanted those folks in our sample. And I'll say that it's not, I wouldn't say it's a failure of vegan advocates that these people are lapsing and that they're lapsing pretty quickly, but it is very much a lost opportunity for us. So regardless of the reason that these people choose to go vegetarian or vegan to begin with, there's an opportunity for us to follow up, layer on top of that messaging, and hopefully encourage them to sustain that choice for the longer term. So hopefully that's the takeaway here. Another couple of interesting points is that lapsed vegetarians and vegans eat substantially less meat than the typical US consumer. Now, these are slightly different samples, it's different studies, but they're pretty comparable. And what we found is that lapsed vegetarians and vegans eat just over half of the meat of a typical US consumer. Now, they may have eaten slightly less meat before adopting the diet as well. We're not actually sure of that, but it's a pretty substantial difference. And so lapsed vegetarians and vegans may more rightly be thought of as semi-vegetarians or active meat reducers. Another interesting one, this is a little complicated to think about, but is that there's no indication of a substitution effect. So when you look at lapsed vegetarians and vegans and you divide them into 2 groups, those who still eat beef and pork, so pig and cow flesh, versus those who do not. Those who do not are not eating more chicken and fish, which is interesting. And it sort of runs counter to what a lot of us have thought and have been concerned about, which is that as people shift away from the larger animals like pigs and cows, are they going to start consuming a lot more chicken and fish? And that may be the case, and we may find that in future studies, but we saw no other evidence of that in our study. Now, I want to spend a moment talking about the self-reported reasons that people gave for lapsing from the diet. And the way we did this is because when you're exploring sort of new ground, which is very much what this study was, you don't just assume you know the range of potential responses. What you want to do is you want to ask it in an open-ended format and then sort of code it according to themes, which is exactly what we did. So the 293 number that you see there, and I know you won't probably be able to read the smaller text, but the 293 you see is the total number of mentions from lapsed vegetarians and vegans for the reason that they lapsed that falls into this theme, okay? And so the dominant reason, the most frequently mentioned reason, was a dissatisfaction with food. People either disliked the food that was available, they were bored with the variety, or they just simply wanted to go back to eating meat. So that was the number one. And I have to say, on that score, I'm incredibly optimistic because of the innovation that's happening right now around vegan products. I think this issue specifically is going to fade over time, and we'll probably see the other issues rise in prominence. The second most commonly mentioned issue was health. And here we see it spread out among a number of different sub-issues. But the 2 that rise to the top were that people felt like they weren't getting enough nutrition. Now, we don't know if that was real or perceived. It could have gone either way, but that was certainly up there. They also felt fatigued, lightheaded, and or weak. And whether or not that was attributable to the vegan or vegetarian diet, in hindsight, they associated it with that, so they reported it accordingly. The next sort of tier of reasons why people lapsed were social issues. And here we see a very common theme. We've seen it in our qualitative work as well, whereas people in relationships with non-veg people or in households or with family members find it very difficult. It's that whole preparing multiple meals issue in a household. And so that social issue is certainly important, as well as inconvenience, which is both access to food as well as the knowledge about how to prepare it in a timely manner and things like that. Rounding out the list are cost and just generally a lack of motivation, which are certainly also important issues, but less so than the others. Now, we also have, there's a whole range of others that we sort of lumped into a general category. You'll find that certainly in the reports that I'll list later. So those are all certainly challenges. They're challenges faced by people who want to become vegetarian or vegan, and they're challenges for us as advocates to try to help get those folks over the hump. But I'm still, and I don't want to step on Tobias's toes, I'll talk about this in a minute, but I still am convinced that the recidivism isn't as bad of an issue as it might seem at first blush. And part of the reason for that is because that earlier figure that I shared, which is 30 million people have tried vegetarianism or veganism. Now, that's 12% of the US adult population. And sure, most of them have lapsed, but that still shows a fair bit of interest. The other thing is that when you think of the lapse rate, so if that's around 84 to 86%, it suggests that the success rate is about 14 to 16%. And just as one data point, that's about 5 times more successful than on average people attempting to quit smoking, right? And so if you just acknowledge, we should acknowledge that this is a fairly big change that we're asking people to make. And so the recidivism, the lapsing may not be terribly surprising, but it's still something that we need to address, of course. Another point of optimism is that more than a third of those lapsed vegetarians and vegans show an interest in readopting the diet at some point in the future. Now, health is the primary motivator as well. Now, if we were to convert every one of those 37%, we would triple the size of the vegan and vegetarian population in the United States. So it's a substantial number. Let's look at what they tell us they need in order to readopt the diet. And we see the themes very much echo the reasons that they lapsed earlier. And here, again, this is in their own words and coded, sort of open-ended answers. Food is very much the dominant theme. And it's the satisfaction with the food, it's wanting greater variety, it's wanting better convenience, more access. And again, those are all things that I feel quite optimistic about. And then the other issues sort of rounded out. You've got social issues coming up again, health issues, just a general motivation that's needed to pursue and maintain the diet, all of that sort of stuff. So these are things that we need to be aware of and hopefully try to introduce into our advocacy materials to try to head off at the pass and get some of those lapsed vegetarians and vegans to readopt the diet. Now, just a few takeaways from a Faunalytics perspective on what the data means. And again, this is necessarily simplistic for this format. I encourage everyone to take a look at the results yourself. But certainly there needs to be, with an 86% lapse rate, there needs to be some degree of focus on veg retention. And we feel that there are a few ways to do that, and here they are, is that one, starting with people who are most likely to actually stick with the diet. And perhaps not surprising, but there's a few groups that stand out in our research to do that. Those are younger people, more secular or non-religious people, and liberal people. Again, not terribly surprising, it probably describes most of the people in this room. We also should increase the focus on how to be vegan and vegetarian, right? And we see a lot more of that happening in recent years, which is very encouraging. But in addition to the why messaging, we need to go beyond just things like meal preparation, and we really need to address some of these key barriers to get people to know how to overcome the social issues that they're facing, maybe even how to overcome some of those health issues that they're faced with. We should diversify the messaging for why to become vegetarian or vegan. And here it's a tricky one because I think long term, what we're looking to do is, it's tough, but we need to move beyond one-touch advocacy, right? Just a single leaflet or a single online ad. We need to create a relationship with our target audience. And if we have that, then we can sequence messages over time, which research suggests will both make them sort of more committed to the diet and also sustain it for longer term. And we need to try to work to bring back those lapsed vegetarians and vegans. Again, if we were able to do that with all of those people who showed interest in readopting the diet, that would triple the size of the vegan-vegetarian population. And finally, and probably most controversially, we also suggest that people should emphasize reductions of animal products over complete elimination. Now, that is unpalatable to a lot of animal advocates, and we certainly understand why. But we think for the long-term growth of the movement, especially when 98% of people are your target audience, that this makes a lot of sense. And there's also a data point from our study that shows that people who transition more gradually to a vegan or vegetarian diet are more likely to stick with that diet. So hopefully that's something that resonates with you as well, that sort of strategy focus, but you don't have to take our word for it, because all of the information is available on our website. We produced, I think it was 4 different reports out of the data. We have an infographic, and then also the complete data set is up there for anyone who wants to take a look and analyze it yourself. If you do, please let us know what you find, and I'm sure we'll be interested in it as well as the movement. Thank you.